Okay, okay, okay. I got a new app for recording because of the. I didn't like. I turned up the input volume. I'll see how that is later. I'll put it to 90, 88 for no reason. I need to remember dog whistles, but I said it there because it's a balance between the number I was gonna put it at and 90. So it's like okay. So here I was gonna talk about something about the modern times, people, aesthetics, self, and all of that stuff, and something about technology. But first I realized that it's very dependent on an essay. Well, I mean not an essay, a rambling I wrote about Birdie, which I actually have to read out if I'm gonna make any of my points. Um, this would be very similar to that one thing I read out, the Twitter thread, because it's also written in a similar way. Okay, so now's where I start quoting myself. Okay, so I already did elaborate on my whole thing on Birdie and Hegelian dialect. I'm gonna stop quoting myself here because I just realized that this is actually a part 2 of the Birdie Hegelian dialect rambling, but I didn't like that one. Honestly, it was primitive and not very well done, so I will not read it. Just go off about the context, okay? Okay, I'll continue quoting here. But I feel modern Birdie holds this point up further than anything else in the sort of superficial sense on the neoliberal age of consumer-creator relations and autism. The main autistic coping mechanism that I've seen in myself and other relatives is a sort of cope with reality that's vaguely distinct to the average dialectical coping mechanism that is insecurity in everyday life. Typically, people work through the dialectic of reality, Lacan, lowercase r, and the real, capital R, Lacan, as well as the symbolic real, R, Lacan, dialectic that turns into the internal external identity reconciliation, but to shorten it, I'll focus on the real reality dialectics first. Both Lacan. Most people use reality as a coping mechanism for the real being less than nothing, absolute lack, and reality being the sort of socially constructed understanding and meaning of the world, like reality, capital R, metaphysical, not reality, lowercase r, physical. Reality, lowercase r, Lacan, covers the real, uppercase r, Lacan, in order to allow the person to live and survive as a being at all, since a coping mechanism to avoid the real is the beginning of all insecurity, and insecurity is the drive to survival. You want to live from the insecurity of death, or from others' perceptions of your death, or etc., and you want to fulfill the necessities that you lack, like food when you're hungry, from this insecurity of death. Autism, as I've seen in most cases, tends to abandon reality, lowercase r, Lacan, which usually is a culturally groomed coping mechanism forced onto children in order to make them productive for capital. So I'm going to stop quoting here and elaborate. It's not always culturally groomed by people. Evolution and nature, like organic nature, the shit that anarcho-primitivists want to return to, that is also a form of cultural grooming, just not by any sort of man, but by the sort of Yada kind of demiurgian society itself in its primitive form, not the form that it has now. So I just wanted to put that, and now I continue the quoting thing. And instead create their own reality. Socially constructed beliefs and morals that uphold your reality are metaphysical, capital R metaphysical, sorry, that contain the real R Lacan, capital R Lacan, in it, and so things like value and meaning can become obsolete. This is still a form of coping, but it's not typical, and since mental illness in the DSM-5 It's more or less summarized by acting in a way not culturally accepted by society, for a reason not culturally accepted by society. If you behave abnormally, but for a reason society can excuse, it's considered a normal stress. But if they decide you're the unreasonable one, they can label you as mentally ill. Autism shows this. Some philosophers support typically socially unacceptable things, such as crime or revolution. End quote here. Or whatever happened on May 6th, or 68, or whatever, I don't care. Continue quoting. Typically, revolution to socially recognized issues like capitalism, or they are seen as normal as a result. But when people speak of culture itself as an issue and support those things as a solution, they're labeled insane. Um, Psychosis is a process of the real leaking through the reality of the one with psychosis and causing an either temporary or permanent departure from the reality. But this form can also affect reality, capital R metaphysical, in a real, lowercase physical way, through hallucinations, though delusions are still important for this conversation. Birdie, in Lacanian psychoanalysis, was growing up with a mindset in a sort of primitive form due to being a kid. The whole development process of the psychotic autist cope, where this real floods the autist reality replacement, and things don't just become obsolete, they become hyper real, and reality being centered around the individual. Birdie is known modernly for not taking the blame, really, ever. He apologizes in the I'm Back video twice, but he just either went back or and blamed the victim, or got someone else to defend him. Increasing to 100. Okay, I'll increase to 90. Because his reality is entirely for him and about him, and that could explain a lot of his narcissistic tendencies. Yeah, I know the Queen interview, the whole it's evil and abuse disorder by Birdie. Very ableist. NPD is not an abuser or evil disorder. They're still people, Birdie, but I don't know why I even want that. And when given justification for his actions, he will extend it as far as it can go. But now, what about the internet? The consumer creator cultural renewal that I talked about earlier in the Hegelian Birdie talk, it's still important now. From Birdie's word, his personality is his disorder, which to I can agree more, not because personality disorders are someone's only personality that's ableist, but because Birdie in modern times is the most superficial internet being there is. I saw the reply from Birdie, no, about Birdie back then doing things that wasn't normal then, but it's now. And how he wasn't exactly the same like he said, but yeah, you're right, I should have clarified that I'm speaking modern Birdie. Because old Birdie is a different, entire discussion on nature versus nurture, versus is Birdie justified. Birdie modernly, though, only takes interest in things that are from his reality, which, as you know, is him. And he also shapes himself after the interests of modern internet users and whatever's aesthetic. He defines himself modernly by aesthetic identity and not actual identity, although no one has absolute identity. And so he becomes the logical consequence of his self and not himself. Birdie died. Ego died for whatever he used to see himself as a person of some form, questionable claim I'm making, and had some sort of actual identity, be it melting with its reality and constantly destroyed and rebuilt by traumatic experience, but now he has abandoned any sort of actual identity for pure aesthetic. Now to tie that back with Hegel's, Birdie's aesthetic identity is the sublation of the modern neoliberal creator-consumer form of identity because we have reduced to forms of niche and ununified communities where the lack of consumer-creator boundaries causes parasocial relationships to blur where one person starts and another begins. Yet because of the moral law of the Greeks being forced into the community as a puritan form, a form of cultural grooming by forcing an idea of morals onto people in order to be a part of community without being problematic, and the lack as an actual connection due to the imaginary the lack of an actual connection due to the imaginary and disassociated state of the internet seen in Rome, it It takes issues from older communities and seemingly leaves out anything to be admired. It's one of the least assimilated forms of assimilationism by forcing identity and moral, while simultaneously not allowing people to truly identify in a meaningful way with the community. This is the issue with the AMC, and now with modern internet. Increasing to 96. Now people, usually edgy kids, try to find solace or community in being problematic. Okay, end quote here. I know I did that, but I wasn't sober at the time. I was I was drinking alcohol a lot, so that doesn't really count because I wasn't sober. Continue quote. Treating it as some sort of countercultural identity like hippies or something despite the cultural and reactionary roots of it, and treat it like a game. Birdie embodies this sort of failure of the assimilation and puritanism of internet communities in a newer, unified form by his single existence as the individual, allowing himself in an aesthetic identity that is and embodies internet communities. He fully assimilates it into himself, and he sublates the internet community's issues both makes them worse and fixes them by being them. And that makes him the least unique and least special, and the most boring, bland, and superficial person, and therefore somehow unique as a result of that. Because uniqueness is indifference, and since everyone is different, being absolutely not different is a difference. Aesthetic identity is the sublation of the modern community. Okay, now that I finished reading that, I can start on my actual thing, which is very, very much focused about subjectivity and objectivity as it goes with culture and the postmodern things. I just want to say that I've never really used the term subjectivity and objectivity, but I do think it describes very well a lot of things. Subjective is things that are the subject of something, that are based true or false based off of things that are, well, not based in reality in physical order. It's something idealistic, but it's also subject as in something that exists in relation to something else, not existing on its own. Something that is purely idealistic, if you really want to see it. Subjective is idealistic and not fully real, if you want to see it in the term of lowercase r, although it does exist in lowercase r, or else it wouldn't exist in uppercase r. That makes sense. It does. But all the same exists in fiction. People are subjective, but the history of society and culture usually goes by claiming one group objective and the other subjective. This is for all things. This is a dialectical system as a whole. Negation. What is negation except for a subjective experience and being forced through an objective statement, an objective identity? Look, the proletariat and the rich people, if you want to be a Marxist, the proletariat exists in complete negation of identity because they are a self-negating process. Well, they want to be a self-negating process in order to solve their existence. The bourgeoisie exists subjectively too, but they claim objective identity while they claim for the proletariat subjective identity. And because the proletariat exists in relation to the bourgeoisie, but the bourgeoisie pretends that it is objective and not existing in relation to the proletariat, even though it relates in subjectivity, they pretend to be objective. So usually that's how it goes. The dialectical system is about forcing objectivity and subjectivity to negating identities and such. Negating identities being purely, if you really want to think about it, a form of proto-aesthetic identity. Because you're just pretending to be something you're not through an identity that's based on the aesthetics of what you think you are. But aesthetic identity is complete assimilation of your entire identity into an aesthetic, and leaving no sort of doubt that you do not exist. However, the proto-aesthetic identity still has a sort of idea that you exist. Proto-aesthetic identity is actual identity. Actual identity is just proto-aesthetic. So really, like, you can't get angry at an aesthetic identity at all. Absolute identity doesn't exist because everyone is subjective. If you look at Lacanian psychoanalysis, the only thing you can claim as objective is absolute lack, but because it's absolute negation and absolute lack, it's the definition of subjectivity. The absolute lack and absolute negation is subject at all. But whatever. But my point is that actual identity is a form of aesthetic identity that's not fully formed. You know, Stirner has this whole thing about egoism, and it's like, everyone's an egoist in different forms, right? You have like the irrational egoist, you have the rational egoist, and then you have just the egoist, the highest form, or whatever. I know some people might say the rational egoist is just the egoist, but they're not. They're not, and you can't tell me otherwise. I've read enough Stirner for this. I read the entire ego and the unique and its property. You know, I don't care. And I know I've said the ego is a spook, and I'm not talking about the ego, as in the ego, the term, because I know Stirnerites will go, well, no, it's actually the unique. The ego is a spook, but the unique is not a spook. The unique is a spook. Any sort of thing claiming that you exist is a spook. You are a social construct. Your entire mind is a social construct created by you in order to justify your own actions. You do not exist. You only exist, quote unquote, as a social construct justified by the fact that you can think. I think, therefore I am is a socially constructed justification for the idea of self or uniqueness. Therefore, Stirner fell for one of the biggest and worst spooks of all time: self, ego. Stirner himself. So, ignoring that, the whole thing I was trying to say is that I think identity does have different sort of things. Everyone in the end is sort of a version of aesthetic identity. You have the proto-aesthetics, or actual identity. You have a complete aesthetic, or just aesthetic identity. Or you have lack of aesthetic, or absolutely destruction aesthetic, or negating aesthetic, which is a form of aesthetic in general. Ego death, which is only a stage that people go through in identity, you know. You have actual identity, you have ego death through whatever, and then you have aesthetic identity. They're all aesthetic. Negating aesthetic, proto-aesthetic, fully aesthetic. Self-realizing aesthetic would also be proto-aesthetic, but that's both under actual identity. All of them is aesthetic identity, but they all take different forms. But in the end, you are an aesthetic, and that's just how it is. But yeah, I feel like ego death is the only way to fully realize such things as aesthetic things, but it can also lead to self-delusion in going against the real and trying to find some sort of other idea on how things work. You cannot rely on the real or rely on coping mechanisms to understand the real or coping mechanisms. It will always fundamentally fail because it can tell you delusions and it can tell you truth. It's a gamble. Gambling isn't good. To subjective morality that I am currently pushing. I'm grooming you all. Yeah, whatever. I was gonna say something else. Oh yeah, I still have some pictures on some vaguely philosophical stuff, which might see like CCRU schizo rambling, but I was inspired by CCRU's schizo rambling. Is saying schizo is actually pretty offensive. I will stop that right now and never say that word again. I need to self-reflect on that. But what I mean is CCRU drawings. I made something similar, not to the level of the nanogram. I could never, but something that does further explain um, my idea through the fiction reality spiral, I'd call it, a spiral between fiction and reality and the whole mixing stages, and the ultimate point of delusion, which I have yet to talk about. But, the mix of fiction and reality, there's a literal stage between that called fiction and reality, which I would be concluding to be a stage of, like, semi-delusion that people usually engage in. However, below that, there is a stage that is just pure fiction in reality, like pure fictionalized and realized things together in a sublated view, where fiction and reality no longer means anything, and fiction and reality are completely negated, while also the ideas of fiction and reality are being lifted up in its entirety as truth and falsity. In delusion, delusion is the ultimate point of mixing fiction and reality together until you get one thing, which is nothing. Delusion. And you're gonna see that all later. Along with all the mixing between fiction, reality, and reality lowercase, which is so complicated that you can't draw it in a graph because it just won't make sense. Fiction, reality, and reality lowercase all mixed together. And it's just, how are you supposed to explain it? So yeah, I don't know. Oh yeah, I'm almost finished with Next Land. I still have to read the Bergson annotation. I'm leaving that for last. I'm not exactly a Nixlandian. Okay, I'm trying to read Nick Land. I don't really like his text though. I'm trying to read more philosophers, Deleuze, Guattari. I can't bring myself to read them. They both suck. But I got a version of Schizophrenia and Capital, along both versions. The Thousand Plateaus and Antiopedes. I got those, and it's like, well, I guess I have that. It's actually kind of funny how it's. I'll talk about that later. But yeah. I really hope that didn't close out the recording file. No, it didn't. This is Antiopedes. You're not gonna see it, but it exists. That's all I want to say. I just realized I got a Chrome PDF, which sucks because I don't want to open it in Chrome. Oh, well, never mind. But yeah, I don't think there's really any sort of actual objective thing anymore. Yeah, just because of the death of God thing, which, by the way, I don't think is the literal death of God anymore. I think it's the distinction that there was a lack of God to begin with, and the creation of a God to get rid of the lack of God, which I would classify as an actual death of God. Death of absolute negation, which could be considered a form of God, in replacement of the Yada Baov demiurgian fake God, which is nature, society, the growth from any sort of living being in existence, and everything that exists. The absolute negation used to be any sort of unified, existent, complete thing, and now it is not a unified, complete thing at all, because it's been destroyed and replaced with a thing that exists, something that exists in a form which it cannot comprehend itself, and therefore cannot truly be God at all. And therefore, the lack of everything, the lack of God, the lack of any sort of being that was itself God, then that death and replacement with a God, which is what brought all of us here, because we are in existence. That is that God. Um, all I have to say is that the death of God is not the death of a lack of a God or the birth of God. The birth of God is the start of all issues. The birth of the demiurge of the Yada creature is the start of all issues and start of all problems, and should be the solution of all philosophy. Well, it's basically the solution of all issues, you know. But once again, I think that it doesn't really matter that much. The Beowulf, that's a silly little snake guy with a lion head. So cute. Well, I still have some time left. I'm just gonna look through and see some things. Oh wait, the next one has a quote by Deleuze, whatever. I don't even care at this point. I need to read Deleuze, but I don't want to. Ugh, I'm starving. Yeah, I am starving. I don't know what to do right now. Oh yeah, I have a really cool background. I don't know. I'm actually gonna make a non-philosophy video soon. I don't think I've heard that in a while. Okay, I'm setting it to 100. Okay, is that better? I still need to check in the post screenings. I guess it doesn't matter. No one really cares about this philosophy thing anyways. This channel is absolutely meaningless, which actually helps concretely form it as a purely aesthetic channel with no actual reason to exist, nor any actual philosophical reason. This isn't philosophy. This isn't a philosophy channel. This is just aesthetic. This is just random videos trying to act like it's a philosophy channel, copying other people who also were just aesthetic people trying to act like they were philosophers. Isn't that kind of ironic?